the award-winning New York Times journalist Amy Chozick, author of the instant New York Times bestseller, Chasing Hillary, 10 Years, 2 Presidential Campaigns, and 1 Intact Glass Ceiling, which I have to tell you is one of the most enjoyable books I have read this year, and I read a lot. I'm so delighted to introduce Amy to you and tell you all about her fun and page-turning memoir, which I literally could not put down. Okay, now if you, like me, are still suffering from election fatigue, I can tell you right away, this is not another Hillary Clinton book. Chasing Hillary, I think, is the palate cleanser we didn't even know that we needed. It's served up in the form of a frothy, fun, moving, and meaningful memoir that New York Magazine called a sort of Bridget Jones' Diary meets What It Takes, coming-of-age rom-com set on the campaign trail with a tragic twist at the end. Spoiler alert, Clinton lost. So I'm so delighted to introduce Amy. I know you all know her from her magnificent work at the New York Times. She's now a writer at large and a frequent contributor to the Times Magazine. Prior to that, she led the paper's coverage of Hillary's presidential campaign. Before joining the Times in 2011, Ms. Chozick spent 8 years at the Wall Street Journal, where she was a foreign correspondent based in Tokyo and covered Hillary and Obama's 2008 presidential campaigns. That is enough from me. I'm positive you don't want to hear me talk any longer, so please help me in welcoming Amy to the podium. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I know Ronan Farrow is having an event at the other Politics and Prose, so I really appreciate you guys coming to mine. It's tough competition. Not quite Comey, but still very tough. I was just going to explain a little bit why I chose to write a really personal memoir, because I think some of the tidbits leaked out and people thought this is Fire and Fury, another campaign book. So this is really personal. I mean, I get into whether I should have freeze my eggs until after the election and all kinds of things that like professional women have to deal with when they have a big job and also a personal life. So, I'm a real student of campaign books. I've read all of them and I love them, but they're all like great men who show how they can get inside the campaigns of other great men. And so 2016 was this confluence of the first woman with a real shot at the presidency and a largely female press corps. Some of my girls on the bus are here. And so I thought there was a real opening to write a book that was much more female, much more personal. I sort of thought of it as Julie and Julia, but with politics instead of cooking, this looming figure in Hillary Clinton looming over my life, which, I think a lot of women have a job looming over them. Mine happened to be the woman who wanted to become the first woman president. And I also fell into covering Hillary in sort of a weird way. I mean, the introduction was very kind, but sort of glossed over how hard it was for me to get into journalism. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. I moved to New York with no job, no clips. I had a stack of clips from the Daily Texan. Sorry, no job, no contacts. I had a stack of clips from my college newspaper that I literally dropped off downstairs in the lobby of like publications I wanted to work at. A very nice security guard in the New York Times building was like, "Ma'am, you're gonna have to leave." So I struggled for years. I was a temp at a Condé Nast, which publishes Vogue and all these fancy magazines, and it was kind of miserable. I was like from Texas, so I spent $30 on jeans and had a plastic clippy in my hair, and I was getting off the elevator once at Condé Nast, and the doors were closing in a packed elevator, and I heard someone say, "Okay, who told her she could wear her hair that way?" And it was a few years of that before I got this job as a news assistant at the Wall Street Journal on the foreign news desk. And it was right after the Wall Street Journal's newsroom had been bombed out on 9/11 and Danny Pearl had been kidnapped in Pakistan. It was just a really interesting, important time to be at the paper. And like everybody was sweaty and grizzled and talking about world events. And I thought, oh my God, I found my people in this grimy newsroom. And then I went to Tokyo and I was a foreign correspondent there. And my boss, in Japan, who covered all of Asia, became Washington bureau chief. And he said, "How'd you like to go to Iowa and cover Hillary Clinton?" So I was like, sounds great. I'm writing that to the White House. I thought that twice, actually. So I go to Iowa, and I didn't know anything about American politics. I mean, I knew very little about American politics because I'd been focused on Japan for a couple of years. I'd heard of this guy, Barack Obama. I'd vaguely heard of it. I didn't know what a caucus was. Years later, I told one of Hillary's top aides that I didn't know what a caucus was. And he said, "That's okay. We didn't know what a caucus was either." And so, I kind of I learned I immersed myself in American political reporting, and it was kind of as foreign to me as Japan was. And then flash forward several years, Jill Abramson, the executive editor of the Times at the time, put me on the Hillary beat in 2013 in the lead up of her covering her running for president. So that's a little bit of a backstory. Since this book has come out, I know you can't write about Hillary without there being some controversy, but it's just really made me see how many open wounds there still are about this campaign and how many questions there are. So I just hope my decade of covering her and my perspective on her can help people understand this figure. And I know right now everything is through the prism of Trump. It's understandable, but I also wrote this book with Hillary. I think it would be unfortunate to always view her through the prism of Trump. She's had a decades-long impact career. Her place in the public eye has been incredibly important barometer of how we view powerful women and, all kinds of things. And I think it'd be unfortunate to always view her through the prism of this man who defeated her in kind of the last chapter of her really public life. So, and then the other thing I guess I should tell you before I start reading is Hillary's male press aides. They all served the same purpose in my life, which was to control coverage, protect Hillary, and they all had similar physical characteristics, like white, 30-something, clean-cut guys. And so I created this character. I call them the guys in the book, and they were like this Greek chorus that was constantly tragicomic Greek chorus that was always like berating me and yelling at me about coverage. And I gave them like monikers that I thought readers, I was thinking of my mom's book group in Texas. Does she know this operative from that operative? It was confusing. So I gave them like kind of jokey monikers, but that is confused. Some people have said you granted them anonymity, but it really wasn't a journalistic choice. It was more of a literary choice. I think they're more identifiable with these monikers. So I was just going to read two short chapters, and then I'll take whatever questions you have. This is in South Africa in 2012. The chapter is called Bill Clinton Kaligani. Bill Clinton was holding a glass of Chardonnay, but not drinking it, the night I walked into his suite at the Saxon Hotel in Johannesburg. It was after midnight. I'd flown to South Africa in a cramped coach cabin with a team of teenage rugby players who were bursting with testosterone and fist-pumping during the entire 16-hour flight, plus a refueling stop in Senegal. I'd checked into my room in the main house of the Saxon, once the palatial private residence of Du Stein, an eccentric billionaire who befriended Clinton during his presidency. As I walked toward Clinton's private luxury villa, I passed rows of photos of Stein with a younger, plumper Clinton. I crossed a wooden bridge over a pond, the sound of peacocks and fireflies and the hum of cicadas in the distance. I opened the villa's heavy engraved doors. The standalone suite had a private bar and a living room decorated in tasteful neutral hues with a scattering of African sculptures. A handful of friends of Bill, also known as FOBs, sat at a nearby table playing Oh Hell, Clinton's card game of choice. They made small talk about Hillary's 2016 prospects. If Romney wins, the party will have to totally pave the way for her. Clinton stood by a row of neatly arranged beige leather bar stools, wearing a baby blue V-neck cashmere sweater, tan driving shoes, jeans, and a friendship bracelet tied around his frail wrist. Chelsea sat on a sunken taupe sofa sipping Evian alongside Barry Laurie, her chief of staff. I'd later confessed to one of the Clinton Foundation donors, Raj Fernando, an algorithmic trader in Chicago, that I felt guilty about how much the New York Times had paid to send me on the Clinton Foundation trip, a 6-night swing through Mozambique, South Africa, Uganda, Rwanda, plus a pit stop in Cyprus so Clinton could deliver a paid speech. Believe me, Raj said, I paid more. It was the summer of 2012, right before Clinton's spellbinding speech renominating Obama at the Democratic National Convention, when no one was paying much attention to Bill Clinton. I'd been in Sun Valley, Idaho, chasing down media moguls and crashing a cocktail party with Wendy Murdoch. Rupert hates the New York Times, but I love you, Wendy said. When Jill Abramson approved the Africa trip, never mind that it had nothing to do with my beat at covering media at the time. Looking back, it's astonishing that the guys ever allowed me to cover this philanthropic swing. We were all so simpatico then that when the Times photographer showed up from a stint in Yemen with no luggage, Clinton loaned him his razor. I was the only reporter who stayed the entire trip, starting with that first night at the Saxon when Bill Clinton talked my ear off well into the early morning hours. Among about a million other topics, he explained that Nelson Mandela had written his memoir on the grounds of the Stein Mansion before it became a 5-star hotel. "Where you're staying was his home, and that's where I stayed until 2010, Clinton said. He looked around at the villa with its high, airy ceilings and spotless marble floors. "It's a wonderful place. I love this place," Clinton said. He paused for a moment. He'd visited the Soweto slums earlier that day. The next day, we would fly to Rwanda, where we would take a military helicopter to a red dirt village to visit a children's hospital. "Yeah, I always feel slightly guilty staying here," he said. He took a sip of Chardonnay. "But I get over it." Over the next 6 days, I vacillated between awe at Clinton's brainpower and verve, feeling blessed to be in this brilliant man's presence, and total exhaustion from his self-absorption and driveling on. After a couple of nights of hotel bar banter, I began to feel like the lucky passenger upgraded to first class on a transatlantic flight, only to wind up next to a raconteur who never needs a nap and who rambles on because of some internal hole to fill. By the final night in the Kampala Serena Hotel in Uganda, Clinton has relayed his own obscure accomplishments. "In Arkansas, we went from 48% to 53% forested land when I was in office." He has summed up how to solve Africa's food shortages. "We got to do things Americans did literally 80 years ago during the Depression." And he has, for what feels like hours, extolled the virtues of soybeans. "You can grow with just a thin layer of topsoil." He starts every other sentence with, "in the 1990s, and when I was president." The guy's even had a name for one of his defensive monologues I got trapped in after asking Clinton about his decision to intervene in Somalia in 1993. "You got Blackhawked," they said. It was after 1 a.m., and all I wanted to do was go to sleep when Clinton told me his advice for how Obama could improve his speech-making. "Suppose we've been friends for 40 years, he said, resting a palm on my shoulder. "If you came to visit me in the hospital and said something pretty and eloquent instead of saying, 'God, I'm sorry, this sucks, I wish I could do more about it,' it's an insult. It's an insult. So I told the president the eloquence should go at the end of his speeches now, never in the middle." I nodded, smiling politely and checking that the red light of my voice recorder was still glowing. He changed outfits at least 3 times a day, usually reappearing in the verdant hotel gardens for dinner and with donors, wearing a linen guayabara and khaki cargo pants. Africa chic. "He's like Lady Gaga," an aide said. The other thing I noticed about Clinton was how often he talked about dying. He hardly thought he'd live to see the 2016 election, never mind help be back in the White House. When the manager of a soybean processing plant asked him to come back next year, Clinton said, "I'm older than you. We have to make sure I'm still alive." When I asked him about Chelsea recently joining the Clinton Foundation board, he said, "We're trying to build it up so it'll still run if I drop dead tomorrow." In Nicosia, we sat down for coffee, and when Cypriots weren't swarming him for photos, I asked whether Hillary would run for president in 2016. "She points out that we're not kids anymore, and a lot of people want to be president," he responded. I saw things in Africa that made me less cynical about the Clinton Foundation. Under tamarind and mahogany trees, aid workers set up a station where deaf children from local villages could be fitted with their first hearing aids. It's hard to care about whether some sleazy foreign donor wants something from the State Department after you've seen a child hear for the first time. And when the Clinton Foundation is maligned, I think of Bill Clinton Kaligani. We were all standing on the tarmac at the Entebbe International Airport, and I'd completely run out of topics to ask Clinton about. I just extended my voice recorder to pick up his stream of consciousness when a military helicopter emerged on the yellow-orange horizon. "Is that him?" Chelsea said, cupping her hands over her eyes as she looked at the setting sun. Moments later, a slender 14-year-old Ugandan boy in his threadbare school uniform stepped out of the helicopter. His name was Bill Clinton Kaligani. His mother had named him after Clinton visited Uganda in 1998. A photograph hangs in the Clintons' Chappaqua home. Clinton is holding the newborn as Hillary, in a wide-rimmed, out-of-Africa hat, looks on. "He was born on the day before we got there," Clinton told me over the hum of the helicopter. "It was one of the most memorable days of my presidency." He walked over and pulled little Bill into his arms. The boy wrapped his hands around one of Clinton's hands and rested his head on that doughy spot on the chest beneath the shoulder. They stayed there like that. After they visited for a while and Clinton said he'd pay the boys' school tuition fees, the staff and donors prepared to board our chartered 737. Aides tugged Clinton towards a separate Gulf Stream, but he wasn't done. He called me over and told me that on the same Africa trip in 1998, a Senegalese farmer had named a goat after him. "We're going to fly the goat in next," he said. So we're flashing way forward to Manchester, November 2015. This is a period during the very difficult Democratic primary when Hillary and her team are very mad at me about a story I wrote. So I was going to flash forward and read a little bit from that. This chapter is called "Spontaneity is Embargoed Until 4 p.m." And this is Manchester, November 2015. No matter how hard I try, I can only see Manchester through the filter of soot that sat on the windowsill of my rented Subaru. The city is a dusky, weary, unfussy place, split in two by the spiky banks of the Merrimack River. It's too far from Boston, where I'd flown into earlier that morning, to be part of its ex-urban sprawl, but too close to have the charm of rural New England. It was November, a year before the general election. I pulled the collar of my jacket tight around my neck and shivered on the short walk up the parking garage ramp into J.D.'s Tavern, the sports bar attached to the lobby of the Radisson, where Hillary would soon arrive to share drinks, bar snacks, and some strained small talk with her traveling press. In the 7 months she'd been a candidate, Hillary had only had one off-the-record drinking session with her traveling press. I hadn't been in Iowa and missed it. But I heard a TV journalist made the rookie mistake of asking how she met Bill, allowing Hillary to filibuster with a story so immortalized in memoirs and speeches and popular Clinton lore that I could recite it verbatim. Oh gosh, it was 1971 at the Yale Law Library. The interactions I'd had with Hillary since the campaign started had almost all been by accident. In September, she'd stopped in at the Union dining car in Laconia to shake hands. She met a high school French teacher who introduced Hillary to half a dozen of her students who all wanted a photo. I stood to her left, and when Hillary pivoted to make sure she'd posed with all the students, she looked at me and said, "She's not in the class. This one I know, she's not in the class. She may speak French, but she's not in the class." Shortly before that encounter, I'd written a story looking ahead to the fall. I interviewed aides in the Brooklyn campaign headquarters about their new efforts to bring spontaneity to a candidacy that sometimes seemed wooden and overly cautious. The campaign brass wanted to put the summer of discontent behind them. The guys came through by providing me with an interview with Robbie Mook, the campaign manager, and Jen Palmieri, the communications director. I'd hardly left the building when the guys hosted a conference call with the entire press corps, telling them almost exactly what they'd told me. I always recorded interviews and took handwritten notes, starring anything that stood out. That way, when I listened back to the audio, I could glance at my illegible scribble and see which quotes had jumped out during the conversation and what I might not have picked up in the moment. On the subway back to Midtown, I plugged in my earphones and listened to my Sony voice recorder, the one I'd bought 8 years earlier in Shinjuku with the Japanese writing on the side. Everything I thought I could build a story around seemed stale now that the top campaign aides had given the same talking points to the rest of the press. Towards the middle of the audio, we discussed how Hillary would try to show voters her softer, more personable side. It was the only original reporting I had. That evening, I sat in Carolyn's office. This is Carolyn Ryan, who's the politics editor, watching as she scrunched her forehead and lowered her reading glasses to edit my story. I could tell how rough a day she was having based on the number of empty Diet Coke cans and the font size on her screen. Carolyn cut and pasted entire paragraphs, plucking the juiciest details out of a mumble of politicalese. Our favorability is higher than any Republican. Even as I reminded myself that a Carolyn edit always made even the dullest of stories jump off the page, reading over her shoulder still gave me the reticent, disembodied feeling of a patient watching a surgeon perform an operation on their vital organs. When she'd stitched it all back together, she shot me a playback, what we called an edited version of the story, and sent it on to the copy editor, who debated me about whether we needed to explain what Hillary's bowl off against Ellen DeGeneres meant. I think it's obvious, I said. The front page headline read, "Hillary to show more humor and heart, aides say." The backlash was immediate. Today's New York Times story on HRC read more like The Onion. Her detailed plan to show more authenticity and spontaneity? #JustDoIt, former Obama advisor David Axelrod tweeted. The I'm with her crowd always assumed the campaign disliked my coverage because of her emails or my reporting on the Clinton Foundation. But that wasn't it. It was the Yorkie and bathroom gate, and that the day she declared her candidacy, I'd written that she hadn't offered a clear rationale for why she was running. Hillary hated that I'd broken the news that the mysterious Diane Reynolds and her private State Department emails had been Chelsea writing under her preferred pseudonym. But nothing put Hillary over the edge quite like the humor and heart story. Donors and top Democrats called her campaign to complain. Jen and Robbie took most of Hillary's wrath, but the guys got it too, for letting me into Brooklyn in the first place. The fall, when Hillary was supposed to restart, instead became what some Democrats started to call spontaneity is embargoed until 4 phase of the campaign. That's the thing about being a candidate reporter. You can't hide. If Hillary had to learn to be an inflatable bop bag bouncing back after whatever the traveling press threw her that day, the guys were a cement wall, rough and unyielding and unable to block me from receiving basic logistical information or asking a question. Ever since the humor and heart piece, I'd been iced out. At an event in New Hampshire at the New Hampshire State House before driving to Hanover, Wyndham, and ending the day in Manchester, Hillary displayed a superhuman cold shoulder, looking right past my multiple shouts of "Secretary, Secretary!" Instead, Hillary answered a question about why Trump got better ratings than she did on Saturday Night Live. Consider the performance. And, adding insult to injury, she called on Fox News. Twice. Obama handled this dynamic differently. Back in 2008, I wrote a Weekend Journal feature about presidents and body image and whether an overweight electorate could relate to Obama given his intense workout schedule and 0% body fat. Okay, so it was an inane idea, and I was widely mocked. The headline, "Too Fit to be President," and Rupert Murdoch's recently buying the Journal did not help matters. Later that day, the press pool trailed Obama to a roadside farmer's market in Florida. He ordered a strawberry milkshake, and as he took a long sip, he looked right at me. We locked eyes, and as he gulped down the frothy mix, he said, "Wow, this milkshake is delicious. Maybe if I had one of these every day, I wouldn't be such a skinny guy." Obama then ordered strawberry milkshakes for the entire press corps. I can safely say Hillary didn't want to buy me a milkshake that day in New Hampshire. So, well, thanks. Thanks for listening, and I'd love to take your questions. Or I can keep reading. Okay.
Did you choose to cover some extent the dispute over her private emails?
Yeah, I going in this, I knew that if I wrote a memoir, it had to be honest. And if I wrote a memoir and I said, the press did everything right in 2016 and my coverage was perfect, I just think it wouldn't ring true to readers. And once you sound like you're being false to readers, you've lost them. And I thought, if I'm going to be honest about the campaign's flaws and Hillary's flaws, I have to also be honest about my own flaws, the media's flaws. And, there were plenty in 2016. So I did want to make a conscious effort to address that in the most honest way I could.
Did you find the campaign changed, with Twitter? Being all the journalists are on Twitter and talking to each other, does that change your reporting? Or I have some friends who are journalists and they're always talking to each other all day, and it's how do you report?
Yeah, no,
do you
absolutely.
find that changes your job? Or
yeah, and I saw the change from 2008 to 2016. I mean, convinced that Donald Trump would not have been elected without the current media ecosystem of Twitter and live streaming. I think during 2016, there was a sense that you could cover the election from your cubicle because you're all tweeting at each other and you're live streaming every speech. And, do we have to get out in the country? Which, of course we have to get on the country and talk to voters. But at the same time, with Hillary, we had a candidate who was so cautious and probably so overly cautious because everything turns into a story with Twitter and Instagram. I mean, people posted videos of how many times she nodded her head at a round table and it went viral. So you had this campaign that was so cautious with the press because of this ecosystem where even the tiniest snippet could go viral and create. But one of the sub themes of the book, I think, is how the media has changed and how it's kind of, I don't want to say the decline of campaign reporting, but the role of kind of being in the bus has changed so much because of Twitter.
Thank you for your book. I was just curious, one of the Trump leadership people one time made a remark that Secretary Clinton, if she were to have to make a decision on something, might go and take 9 hours or 19 hours worth of homework on that decision, and that we just go ahead and fly by night, make a decision. So I was just wondering if you witnessed some of her diligence in doing her work.
Oh, absolutely. She's nothing if not the consummate student. I mean, I wrote a story ahead of 2016 when she had consulted 200 advisors to try to craft her economic policy. So absolutely. I mean, and I think sometimes that's, she had a great line in one of the debates against Trump, which he kind of made fun of her for being too prepared. And she said, "I've also prepared to be president." And I thought that was a great line. But at the same time, I think some of it was a hindrance. Kind of, I think voters thought some of the things she said were too cautious, too poll tested. I always wonder, in an alternate universe, I think she probably could have never gotten away with it, but I imagine her coming out of that first email press conference about her email server. And what if she did what Donald Trump did and she just said, "Of course I didn't want you people reading through my emails. Look at what you put me through in the 90s. It turned out to be nothing. That makes me smart." And then just say, "I'm done talking about this." I just wonder if she had that kind of radical honesty, what would have happened. She probably would have gotten killed for it, but I do wonder.
Since you covered the Clinton Foundation, was there ever any thought given by these political whiz kids of actually giving the Clinton Foundation to, say, the Carter Center or something like that?
Oh, it's interesting. I think definitely when it looked like Hillary was going to win and they started kind of winding down parts of the foundation, they were thinking about partnering with someone like Paul Farmer or Bill Gates or some other group. But that was towards the fall when they really thought she was going to win and they had to do something about the foundation.
On page 15 of your book, you write that you invited 2 press aides of Hillary Clinton to your own wedding. You've been a reporter in Japan, and I wondered, how do you reflect on the interconnectedness between the U.S. political press corps and the U.S. politicians?
Yeah, I mean, you cover these people for so long, you travel everywhere they go, and you do become friendly. I mean, I think you have to have a cordial relationship with someone. I mean, I didn't. I failed at that. We had a very toxic relationship. But initially, when I was at the Wall Street Journal and I was kind of a kid reporter, I did have friendships with these people. I mean, we traveled all over the country together. And then it was kind of a change from 2016. But then Hillary's aides traveled on the same bus as the press. So, it's hard not to establish some friendships there.
Can you talk a little bit about how her 2008 campaign, really their relationship with the press versus her 2016 campaign?
Yeah. So I always think that Hillary was a better candidate in 2008, but she had a better campaign in 2016. I mean, so when she ran for president in 2008, she'd been a New York senator and she was really involved and she was always in touch with her upstate constituents and factory towns. And so when she ran for office, I think she was very connected to problems people were having, particularly in places like Pennsylvania and Indiana. And then, but the other aspect of her in 2008 was she had as a senator, you have a press corps following around, and she didn't have any press corps. She had the New York press corps. So it was like the New York Post and these tabloid guys, and that they became her traveling press. I mean, I joined with them, but they'd been covering her for years. So she had a rapport with her press corps, and she would come back with a goblet of wine and crack jokes. And on Valentine's Day, she called our significant others because she felt bad for keeping us away. So she was much more comfortable with the press. And I think it's partly because she was used to these reporters, but I also think she was losing. And like whenever she was losing, she became a better candidate and she let down her guard. Bill Clinton tells me at one point in Nevada after she lost New Hampshire that like we're always running better as the underdog. And so that was part of it. And then when we got to 2016, she always thought she was going to win and she was cautious. She was very cautious. So like why mess that up by saying something to reporters? I also think she really liked her State Department press corps. She thought they were substantive and they asked about foreign affairs and suddenly she had this political press that was yelling at her about emails. I mean, a lot of other things too, but in her mind, we were kind of just obsessed with the kind of daily stories and in the White House, she had described the political press to her friend Diane Blair as big egos and no brains. So those hard feelings went way back. Good question. Fact check, kind of true.
So I had a question. I know Bill Clinton, he obviously had to take a kind of a less public role, with his wife running for president. I'm just curious as your thoughts, if you think that was a little bit more frustrating for him not to be in the limelight as much, and what role did he actually play in some of the strategy and in the campaign in itself? Yeah, I have a lot about this in the book because Bill Clinton was kind of trying to push Hillary's younger aides to reach out to the white working class voters who he won in 92 and 96. And they were like, yeah, those voters have left the party. Like we're good. We're focused on these, pockets of the country, the Obama voters who we think we can win. And so there was a lot of like sidelining Bill, who is obviously this great political strategist, one of the greatest strategic minds, of the 20th century. And there was a lot of not listening to his advice. I mean, I have a chapter called Bill's Last Stand where he's just like, screw it. And he goes on like bus tours around the Panhandle and Wisconsin and Ohio. And he's just like talking to like 20 people at these town halls because he's just like, if they won't listen, I'm going to go do it. But the other interesting tension between, I think, Bill Clinton and his generation and the younger operatives where they were so data-driven, Hillary's new campaign aides, and they had a brilliant organization. They had operatives in all the right places. They had an organization that was second to none. And Bill Clinton kept saying, well, what's the point of an organization if there's no enthusiasm? Like if people don't like Hillary and people don't see the Hillary that I see, what's the point of the organization? So there was always this tension between organization and enthusiasm and the belief that like, no, a great organization is like, this is what we need. And Bill Clinton saying like, screw the organization. We need to get the enthusiasm, if people aren't enthusiastic. So.
You partially answered this, but did you know her at all when she was Secretary of State and when she was relaxed and when she was relaxed and fun and easy to be with?
I wish. During the State Department years, I was, covering some other things. We did the reporting on Bill Clinton. And so I didn't know her that well then. I wish I did. I mean, the times I saw her, the times I saw that Hillary were in 2008, especially when she really felt like she had nothing left to lose and she would be very chummy with her press corps. But I didn't see the State Department.
Her feet up, have a glass of wine.
Yeah, she did do that in 2008. Yeah. Yellowtail, really bad wine, which was endearing.
Yeah, right.
Which was endearing.
No offense, but you and a lot of people, journalists, seem very hard on her. I didn't get it. She seemed like a nice person. She wanted to do progressive things. Yeah. She was far from perfect. Now who do we have? A criminal, a sex abuser, someone who could blow up the world. And I'm not exaggerating.
Well,
what was the big deal with Hillary? She was far from perfect, but my God, what a difference.
No, a couple things.
You had the right to write about her. I'm not challenging.
No, but a couple things. Like I've been getting ever since the book came out, like Fox News and the Free Beacon saying I'm obviously in love with Hillary. So it's one of those things with Hillary. It's like some people say you're too hard on her and you hate her, and then like the same exact quote can be used as like you're in the tank and you love Hillary.
You can't believe Fox.
It's complicated. It's complicated. But I do think I see your point, and I feel her supporters' genuine anger over how she was covered and how her emails were covered. And I think those are really legitimate concerns that we should listen to and assess. At the same time, I also think it's sort of a dangerous proposition for journalists to say, like, this candidate's under FBI investigation and that's a bad thing, but like the other guys, like Russian hookers and bankruptcies, and like he's so beyond the pale that like let's use kid gloves on his opponent because the other guy. I think it's a dangerous proposition when journalists start deciding like this candidate's opponent is so bad that we'll be, softer on her.
Well, I didn't
then
say
you're
that.
putting your hand on the scale in, I think, an uncomfortable way.
I didn't say that. I
Yeah.
just didn't understand
Yeah.
why so many people seem so angry at her. And
Yeah. Well,
overlooked.
Hillary hate is like a large-scale psychic phenomenon that has never made sense to me. I mean, like, you make a good point. It's not about her politics. I mean, she's like a pretty central, like, nothing she's proposing is like wildly offensive to either side. It's something about her, and like, you can't get away from the idea that that has to do with gender. I mean, it has to. Like, why? I mean, I remember I grew up in Texas, and I have this scene in the book when I first met her when I was 16, and like, I heard talk radio saying how scary she was, and friends at school saying how scary. And I met her, and I was like, wow, this is a nice woman. Like, I don't understand. And that hatred has continued for 30 years, and I just think it has to do with her being, one of the most powerful women in the country, in the world. It has to do with gender. There's like nothing else to explain that level of hatred, I think.
I think that's a big part of it. I
Yeah,
agree.
yeah.
Hi, Amy.
Yay, hi.
I listened to your audiobook, which is great, by the way.
I'm sorry to subject you to 8 hours of my voice.
But I just wanted to, the question I had for you for this, I know this is a memoir, but I'm just wondering if there are lessons here for future female presidential candidates and what not to do or what to do. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, it's not so direct as like, other books, I think, like here's how you, but I hope that there are takeaways from this, because there are things I noticed that I didn't actually even notice at the time, but as I was writing, I noticed, like, this is one that stands out. I was at the Iowa State Fair in 2015, and Donald Trump landed on his helicopter, and the reporters were like taking rides on the helicopter, and he was giving kids rides, and it was like, he's so connected to the working man. The helicopter was a big hit. So this was like striking to me, because in 2008, Hillary had chartered a helicopter in Iowa, and it became like the symbol of how out of touch her campaign was. It was like, oh, she's totally out of touch. You're supposed to be on a bus in Iowa, and she chartered this helicopter. And it was like, I mean, for years we used the helicopter as like the symbol of how her elitism and out of touch. And they're like, Donald Trump landed a helicopter and everybody thought it was great. And I was like, do you have to have a penis to pull off the helicopter? Like, I don't understand this double standard. Like, to me, it was like the starkest example of like the double standard. And also, he owned the helicopter. She just chartered it. It like blew my mind how they were covered in such a different way. And so the chapter is called A Tale of Two Choppers. But like, I hope that that's like informative. Like, I don't have some big takeaway for candidates. If you're running, don't use a helicopter. But I do hope that like the way we cover candidates and the way voters perceive candidates, like, you'll read this and realize like the stark double standard that existed. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you.
I was curious to know if, at all, your gender affected the way Hillary and her team responded to you in your writing. Would it have been different if you had been a male reporter covering her campaign?
Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, it's funny because the right wing has been like, all these girls who covered her were in the tank because we're all women. And I actually think Hillary's people around her thought the women would be harder on her in some way, like to prove that we're not in the tank. We would be catty or like, tougher on her to kind of prove something. It's funny because this book also draws on like a lot of archival emails I've read and speeches and press conferences Hillary's given back in like to Arkansas. And at a press conference in the White House, she had said she'd gotten grilled on like cattle futures and whitewater. And they said, thank you so much, First Lady. It was great that you did this. And she said, you should do this more often. And she said, well, Eleanor Roosevelt had a press conference every week, but she had an all-female press corps. And she said, maybe if I had that, I would do a press conference every week. But like fast forward 30 years and she had an all-female press corps who she like mostly ignored. So.
Thank you.
Hi. I was actually going to ask a very similar question. I studied politics and gender and really interested in that. But I guess I'll ask a slightly different side, which is, as a female journalist, I'm curious if you felt that your gender impacted how you interacted with the other journalists, the other, reporters covering the campaign, as opposed to, just with the candidate herself or and their teams.
Yeah, my fellow girls on the bus can attest to that. Definitely. We had like a really great camaraderie, and like, some of the women who were mothers would call and read to their babies at night. And like we talked about, I'm sure we talked poor Dan Merica from CNN was one of the only men. He was very good with all the girls. But like, yeah, we definitely had a really tight. I think there was a tight-knit family. It was funny. After the book came out and some of my friends on the bus read it, they were like, I'm so nostalgic for 2016. I was like, really? The most awful, toxic campaign in history? But like, you really become like a family, and like you do miss each other and have a camaraderie for sure. Thanks.
You mentioned that it was your first chapter was talking about your trip to South Africa. What was there anything to be learned from your experience in South Africa? And did any of the Clintons meet a guy called Julius Malema?
I don't know the answer to the second part of your question, but certainly going to Africa with Bill Clinton, he is such a popular figure globally. I just think like we get so, and myself included, you get so bogged down in kind of the investigative stories about the Clinton Foundation, but like to see him in action in Africa, he has such a connection to people, and he could just, he like, at one point we went to this like red dirt, this village with red dirt, and he was like crouching on the ground in his suit to like pet a cow, and he was like, we got these same dairy cows in Africa. He was like connecting to farmers in Africa the same way he would farmers in Arkansas. It was really remarkable. And the other remarkable thing I would say that I witnessed with him is like, a lot of people can get, not a lot of people, but some politicians are like great with the working man, and some politicians are like great schmoozing with the 1%. And like Bill Clinton could so seamlessly go from the like 6-star hotel with the rich donors to like the little village. It was really amazing. It was really remarkable.
Yeah. Just an afterthought. Julius Malema is a vocal opposition individual in South Africa, and he stands up in Parliament. He starts fights in Parliament. He does, in some ways, he's an alter ego of our friend who's the president of this country now.
Interesting.
A real wild man, actually.
Interesting.
So, just a matter of interest. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good question.
Apologies, I arrived late, so you may have addressed this before I got here. I'm very curious why Hillary didn't take Donald Trump on the daily talk shows. I got almost nauseated at times watching, the show that I watched the most was Morning Joe. Now, Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski, now they've done a pretty good job of critiquing this administration and really taking them apart. But during the campaign, they were literally playing footsie with the man. They were talking, the camera came on a little early a couple of times, and they were sort of telling him what they were going to tell, what they were going to ask and stuff like that. They're sitting around a table. And if he wasn't there live, he would call in. They would always take his calls. And Hillary never was on that show, maybe once or twice.
They asked a million times. That's
what I wanted to know.
She said
she
no
just didn't do it.
Yeah, she said no to everything. I counted.
Why?
I counted 47. We asked her for interviews about national security, about I wanted to talk about her work with women and girls. They said no to 47 interview requests from me, and I know that the cable shows had also offered her the chance to call in and do this. Right. And look, I think she was ahead. I think she didn't think that she needed to go toe to toe with him like that. But I know, after the election, she's complained that he got so much free cable time. But she did say no to a lot of those interviews.
And he got a lot more than he should have, but she didn't take advantage of what she could have. Correct?
Yeah. I think she had a lot of my thinking about Hillary goes back to the 90s, and she'd built up a lot of scar tissue about the media, and I think a lot fairly, what the media had put her through. And I think by the time she got to 2016, there was a lot of scar tissue built up, and a real protective layer that just she didn't want to, do that. So, but your shirt is very illustrative of your political position.
So what response have you gotten from Hillary's side about this book, and what did you think of her book?
I thought her book was good. I actually liked Living History better. I mean, I thought her book was, what happened was good in that I liked the voiciness of it. But it wasn't
voiciness.
It was voicey. Did you read it? It was like you was like writing in like
conversational.
Like conversational, right? Mm-hmm. Hard Choices was like. I mean, it wasn't a bit. It wasn't hard to have a better book than Hard Choices, but I liked what happened. But I liked Living History actually even better. That was more interesting.
Well, so have you gotten any feedback? I know Chelsea Clinton has had a few things to say, but
it's been like if you read the book, like I was anticipating blowback. I got blowback from even sympathetic stories I wrote. It's been a little bit frustrating because I feel like there is a reflex of kind of to reject something, to reject it without kind of reading it. And I am pretty self-reflective. I think a lot of Hillary's supporters have been craving self-reflection from the media. And I tried to offer that. And then there's just sort of like a knee-jerk reaction of attacking it. And so that's been, I wish people would give it more of a chance.
And what about your own colleagues? Because you were very honest.
Yeah.
And so what's been
I have heard no complaints from my colleagues. A lot of them came to my book party the night before last. So yeah, I haven't heard. I know that and I think it's good. I know there are debates in the newsroom about like how we handled the Russia emails, the Podesta hacks, and there's different opinions about that. But I think that's good. I mean, part of why I wanted that to be the excerpt that ran in the New York Times is like I wanted to start. I think there should be debates. Like the Russians are going to be interfering in our democracy in 2018 and 2020, and the media is very much part of that strategy and disseminating that information. So I think newsrooms should take a hard look at how we handle those. Thanks.
Hi. I go to school like down the street, and we're learning about U.S. history, and we've only ever learned about men. Do you think that Hillary will go down in history?
I mean, I hope so. Somebody tweeted after the election, a man, surprised, that like after all that, Hillary's just a footnote to history. And like, I really disagree. I mean, I really think that we are going to study her career as this barometer of how we view powerful women in this era of our life. Back to when she said, in the 90s, she was asked why she had a career. And she said, I suppose I could have stayed at home and baked cookies and had teas, and was like, had to apologize for that for 20 years. But she was ahead of her time. She was just like woman defending her choice to have a career. So I think Hillary's career is going to be incredibly important. Doris Kearns Goodwin, the historian, I was talking to her about how losing candidates can sometimes have even a greater impact. When Goldwater lost, it really laid the foundation for the conservative movement. Conservatives were mobilized, and I think Hillary's loss may have done that for women. Like you see all of these women running after her loss, and I think that maybe we'll look back on history and like her defeat, not just her defeat to anyone, because if she had lost to Jeb Bush, I think would be different, but for her to lose to a man who bragged about sexual assault, and I think that spurred a lot of women to run, and maybe we'll look back on history as like this was the moment that she actually did ignite a feminist movement just by losing.
And if who would you want to run in 2020?
I don't know. There's a lot of it's funny. People will keep saying like, oh, that person, they're not electable. I'm like, we're still going to do that? We're still going to guess who's electable? So I stay away from guessing on that. But
thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. You seem to be, in observing your own presentation, very vibrant in your description of Bill Clinton, and very animated. When I don't see that quality when you talk about Hillary. Are you able to describe her personality so we can really understand more? You've spent so much time with her.
Yeah. I mean, well, for one, Bill Clinton gave me that. I had that amazing access in Africa. I never was the only reporter traveling around Africa with Hillary, so I did have that insight into him. But there are other parts of the book for sure that explain her. I mean, with Hillary, it was I didn't get to know her because we were sipping Chardonnay in a hotel suite. I got to know her through her friends. I got to know her through. I mean, I had sources from her college roommate to her friends in Arkansas, and studied every chapter of her life from when she was a working mom in Little Rock and I talked to her classmates on the debate team at the Park Ridge High School to see how she honed her debate skills. So like I would say the way I got to know Hillary and the way I communicate Hillary in the book is largely through these chapters of her life that I really did a lot of deep reporting on. For instance, when she worked at the Children's Defense Fund and she went undercover in Alabama to investigate school segregation. It's very hard to find things about Hillary that nobody knows because she's been around so long, but that was a chapter that hadn't really been explored. And I went to Alabama and talked to people, Children's Defense Fund back then. And so I got to know her like through those secondary sources almost, more so than one-on-one.
What have you learned about her personality from these sources?
It's interesting. The story about her going undercover. So basically this was after, obviously school segregation was illegal, and these private academies sprung up in the South. They call them segregation academies and Hillary Clinton went to, Hillary Rodham went to Alabama, and a town called Dothan, and she pretended to be a mother who wanted to enroll her son in this school. And she went through all the questions, and she said, can you promise me that he's going to be in a white only school? And they said, absolutely. So she busted them. And then she went back and filed a report so that they would lose their tax exempt status. This was under the Nixon administration. But to me, that was the best example of how Hillary believes the most change is made. Like Bernie Sanders released a lot of pictures of him like out front with a banner in civil rights marches. Hillary was not out front with a banner. She was doing her homework. She was doing her research, and she was going back and filing a report to change policy. Like basically the broadest way to impact millions of people would be to change policy to make these schools lose their tax exempt status. And so that sort of exemplified her activism to me. It wasn't like I'm out front with a banner, but it was how do I implement policy? And I think that's like her friend Diane Blair, whose letters I studied a lot, said Hillary would be happy in an office somewhere crafting policy. And I always thought that was why she wanted to become president. It was the best way to change people's lives was through policy. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your insightful questions.
Great
and thank you, Amy, for being here.
Thank you.